As soon as you're born, they make you feel small by giving you no time instead of it all.
If you lived in London when John was here, every day you could walk through the city and you'd see the billboards for the Evening Standard, the London afternoon newspaper, and there would, one day in two, there would be something about John having done some new stunt. And he had a real genius for just making things lively.
Well, it's part of the soundtrack of my life, even without the politics. When you add the politics, he adds up to a very special person.
I love his music, I love the sound of his voice, I love the lyrics that he wrote.
He was an amazing poet who politicised himself at a point in time when the world needed someone like that.
What he represents really is like a revolution, but a revolution that was a positive revolution.
You know, he's one of those few people that if, you kind of imagine that if you'd have met him would have, you know, not let you down, like a lot of heroes do.
Well, he's become this immovable icon, like Che Guevara in a strange kind of way.
I believe it was 1962, I saw the piece about the Beatles, and at that time, the only thing I knew about English pop music was Lonnie Donegan. And I just looked at this picture and I said, don't be silly. They're never going to conquer America. You must be joking. And then I was driving in my car and I had the radio on, and I think it was I Want to Hold Your Hand, you know, came on the radio. And I think I had to pull over, just because it was so stunning and so startling.
I was born in 1954, so when the Beatles exploded on the scene in the early 1960s, I was old enough to put a shilling in the jukebox and play something, and I always, of course, went for the Beatles. I went to see them in the Caird Hall in Dundee when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I screamed, I'm sorry to say, in a rather girlish way, along with everyone else.
How would you define Beatlemania?
I couldn't define it. You know, a lot of people have tried. I'm not going to try. Leave it to the psychologists and let them get it wrong.
My first encounter with John Lennon would be when I was 8 or 9 years old. And then throughout the 60s, I loved the Beatles, as most people did, but I always loved John most of all.
My first memory of John Lennon was the Beatles, really, just seeing the Beatles, or maybe watching Hard Day's Night. I think I saw Hard Day's Night on TV when I was very young. I mean, they were all kind of cool then, but I think John was my favourite Beatle from quite early on.
They think your haircuts are un-American.
Well, it was very observant of them, because we aren't American, actually.
True.
The only way to consume music then was not even radio, really, was in public places. We used to go to a cafe called the Haparanda, and they had a jukebox.
You had one marvellous gift, which was stripping back the music and making really powerful, bare bones rock and roll with its foundations in the music that he'd first loved. I think the music he liked best of all was the very earliest music of Elvis Presley, the really early, the Sun records, which were very, very basic. One guitar, one bass, one drummer, one voice, and a lot of echo. And just a really simple, driving, powerful, immediate sound.
Well, it's one for the money, two for the show, three to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't you step on my blue suede shoe. Well, you can do anything but stay over my blue suede shoe. Well, you can knock me down, step in my face, slander
My mum was young in the 60s, so I was brought up kind of listening to loads of the Beatles stuff, and then also his solo work.
Whether you were cool or and trendy, or whether you weren't, you were just kind of like you know, not interested in popular music, there was still that fascination with this band.
You know, I kind of got, you know, I totally devoured everything to do with the Beatles. I'd get the newspapers and cut it all out. I used to get on the garage roof and play them loud and have tennis rackets with my mates, pretending to be the Beatles kind of thing.
What about the sense of humour? I know that you carry out this study all over England about the different senses of humour in the north and in the south.
Don't you, boys? They know different things in different parts of the country, don't they? You mean you can tell a joke in Manchester and they don't get it in London? Really? They can't hear it.
Just winning, you know.
Liverpudlians are very good audiences usually, yes.
Yeah. Let's ask the boys, how much has this big thing affected your own personal lives? You know, has it changed you very much yourselves?
No, it's just
There's nothing wrong with him.
He was out there, up front, bold, cocky, even slightly aggressive. And I liked all of that. He was the rebel. And I had a rebel heart, I think, even then.
It's pretty apparent whenever you watch them that he is very much the leader, and that's kind of comes across because he was the strongest personality there.
Lennon was also an extremely funny man. A lot of things like the Beatles are bigger than Jesus. You know, he knows what he's doing. It is going to provoke, but you shouldn't take it entirely seriously.
I just didn't mean what everybody thinks I meant, you know. I'm not anti-Christ or anti-religion or anti-God, you know.
It created tremendous controversy, which even I, in my young years, was aware of. It had the benefit of being true, even though it was probably ineptly expressed, and of course was only transitory. Jesus was bigger and is bigger now than the Beatles were. But at that height of Beatlemania, there's no doubt that there were more people out screaming for the Beatles than were out screaming for Jesus.
It's pure provocation. It makes a point, and it's not really saying, oh, great, we're more popular than you. It's just like, it's just a fact. Look at the record sales.
Did you mean that the Beatles are more popular than Christ? When I was talking about it, it was very close and intimate with this person, and I know who happens to be a reporter. And I was using expressions on things that I just read and derived about Christianity, only I was saying it in the simplest form that I know, which is the natural way I talk. And I just said it in those things like, we're more popular than Jesus and so and so and so and so. But she took them, and people that know me took them exactly as it was, because they know that's how I talk. And I was pointing out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. You know, I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
I think he just got badly advised, really, didn't he? I mean, he got badly let down by Epstein. I think Epstein handled that in an appalling way, but, you know, I mean, I think it's just that very public, you know, it's growing up, really. I mean, because, you know, they were kids when they started, and they grew up in public and just had to deal with that, and it's like they had to be true to themselves. And that's the thing that I always loved, you know, especially with John Lennon. And John Lennon, you know, put a lot of pressure on the rest of the Beatles to be true to themselves.
And that was the great thing about John Lennon. He didn't care about the fact that people came down with so much outrage after he said that. He was just saying what he thought.
But John was slaughtered in the United States over that by the establishment. It helped mark him out as a target, which he later became in the Hoover era when he was living in the United States. And it reminds you of just what the United States was like in the 1960s.
The disc jockey, Tommy Charles, who started this row off, has said that he won't play your records until you've grown up a little. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't mind if he never plays them again.
Tommy, why this violent reaction to what John Lennon said?
Well, I wouldn't call exactly what I have done a violent reaction. However, the Beatles for a long time have been able to, because of their tremendous popularity throughout the world, especially with the younger set, have been able to say whatever they wanted to without any regard for judgment or maturity or the wisdom of it. And no one yet has challenged them to any tremendous degree where it might count. I want them to make me change my mind about them. I want to see I want to see them grow up a little bit, I guess.
The United States is still quite a conservative country religiously. In the 1960s, it was the backwoods, and they were burning Beatles records, Beatles posters and memorabilia of all kinds. Well, they liked, the reactionaries in the United States liked burning things in those days, including uppity black people. And John, I think, became an honorary black at that point.
The thrill is gone. The thrill is gone away. The thrill is gone, baby. The thrill is gone away. You know you done me wrong, baby.
Did you have any Beatles records yourself?
Yes, sir. I had about 4 albums and a lot of 45s, and I don't have them anymore.
What have you done?
I've given them away.
We forget we're Beatles sometimes. You can't help it. We're still us inside. And if you say something like that, Britain's becoming a police state. You say it exactly the same as anybody in a pub saying it to their friend across the bar. About some sweeping statement, which they can't back up anyway.
And it's obvious it's not to be taken literally, because if it was, then you wouldn't be allowed to say that, would you?
What John Lennon said really didn't have any effect on me because, well, I think for myself, and there's certainly no comparison between Jesus Christ and John Lennon because I don't think that Christ came to be popular. As a matter of fact, he was one of the most unpopular people that have ever been alive. And there is no connection between the two.
Why are people so angry about it down here, then?
Well, a lot of people are good Baptists down here, and not to say anything against them, it's just that they feel everything about religion, they take it very personally.
I don't think they were comparing themselves to Jesus. I think they were deploring the fact that teenagers, like rock and roll better than Christianity.
It seems to me you've always been successful because you've been outspoken. Does it seem a bit hard to you that people are now knocking you for this very thing?
Yes, Richard. It seems very hard. It seems hard, free speech.
But do you mind being asked questions, for example, in America, people keep asking you questions about Vietnam. Does this seem useful?
It seems a bit silly to be in America and for none of them to mention Vietnam as if nothing was happening.
But why should they ask you about it? You're successful entertainer.
That is why because Americans always ask showbiz people what they think about it. So do the British, Showbiz, you know how it is. But I mean, you've just got to, you can't just keep quiet about anything that's going on in the world unless you're a monk. Sorry, monks, I didn't mean it. I meant actually.
John was not a serious political figure, but I think he made people aware of quite a lot of issues.
Well, when he left the Beatles, obviously the Beatles was a very big kind of pop sensibility, and I think that he left and pursued and sort of saw his position in society and popular culture as being somebody who people followed and looked up to. And I think that when he left the Beatles, he utilised that position in a political way. And not a lot of people really do that because it takes a lot of courage.
The Beatles were drifting apart on their own, We don't want to be dragged on stage playing She Loves You when we're 50, Here they are again, yesterday, all my So a long time ago I said that I didn't want to be singing She Loves You when I'm 30. Well, I was 30 last October, and that's about when my life changed. The Beatles made it, and they had all the money they wanted and all the fame they wanted, and they found out they had nothing, and then we started on our various trips with LSD and Maharishi and all the rest of the things we did, and the old gag about money and power and fame is not the answer. We didn't have any hope just because we were famous. We have no super answer that came through Beatles or through power. The Beatles in that respect were irrelevant to what I'm talking about.
Let's welcome now, please, Mr. John Lennon and Miss Yoko Ono.
His relationship with Yoko, you know, is one of the most striking and interesting manifestations of romantic love that has ever played out in the public eye.
It's a very intriguing period of his life when he first met Yoko and kind of started taking an interest in the art world.
She was having a show at this gallery, and I knew the fellow that ran it, so it's a bit embarrassing being a Beatle anyway, going into a shop, never mind going into a gallery, because they either all leap on you thinking, oh, he's another mug, you know, like a Texan, he'll buy anything. And I had a bit of a hang-up about art too, having been to art school, and disliked the sort of attitude of the so-called artist, you know. So anyway, I finally got to this show, and she came up and said, she didn't know who I was, and was saying, do you like to hammer a nail in? It's 5 shillings. So I said...
You didn't want to pay.
I didn't have any money either, so I said, I'll hammer an imaginary nail in and give you an imaginary 5 shilling. And she agreed with that. She accepted that on the same basis as we accept her work. You know, I'd accepted her work, and that was how we met, actually.
I'd be lying if I said to you I was a great fan of Yoko's. I'm not. But John loved her, that's clear.
When I saw John and Yoko together, in the brief times I did see them together, it was impossible not to be struck by their empathy, by the sort of mutuality of their relationship. They really did spark each other off, and they enjoyed provoking each other, sharing things, sharing a commonality of viewpoint on things, but also, they disagreed. He wasn't totally starry-eyed about her, and vice versa, but they really did share something. There's no question about that.
I guess Yoko Ono just basically taught John Lennon that, what he was doing was art, and not, because he probably didn't know, really up to that point, that it was as timeless as it was, as important as it was, as powerful a tool, and that's probably why he tried to focus it onto the politics.
Lennon rocked up in New York. I think it became tremendously difficult for Lennon to live in England. The degree of press scrutiny was immense. He couldn't walk to the shops to buy a pint of milk or a packet of cigarettes or whatever. And I think meeting Yoko and going to New York enabled him to become a little bit more anonymous.
John Lennon loved America. He loved New York. He loved the anonymity of being in a city where he could walk the streets and not be recognised.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear.
We want to be part of it. Like the people said, the Beatles were the movement. The Beatles were only ever part of a movement. We were influenced as much as we influenced.
I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Well, John Lennon was very much a child of the 60s, and the word love in the 60s took on a lot of meanings and became a very, very broad and rather carelessly used term.
Love and peace had never been spoken about. Not so much before John Lennon, but certainly before the hippie movement. No one talked about love and peace in World War II and World War I, when there was a substantial part of American society who didn't want to take part in those wars. They didn't articulate themselves in love and peace ways.
It's probably one of the most pointed ways in which the younger generations since then are able to look back and mock the ideals and the practices and the graffiti and the song lyrics of the 60s.
John Lennon's love and peace was a different thing. It was slightly more spiritual. It was, if we have peace, the world will be a better place.
He added to the sort of the mass of feeling. In some ways, he symbolised feelings against the Vietnam War, against Nixon at a time of political upheaval in America. So although John was never somebody who would have stood for office in any way, he did serve as a kind of rallying figure.
He was unashamed and unembarrassed about his support for the movement. So you see, if you like, a trajectory of the Beatles being part of a youth cultural revolution, emerging from the Beatles, an iconic and really quite radical figure.
My dad was kind of like sort of working class right wing, so the peace thing was something that he wasn't that interested in and was quite critical of.
And that's partially because the hippies were often quite silly and often quite wishy-washy. But those terms have been devalued now to an extent where they don't mean as much as they did. And it's not a banner, it's not a slogan to rally people around anymore.
I've never quite known what John Lennon meant about love. Was it all you need is love, or money can't buy me love, or I love myself enormously? I have no idea quite what he meant by love. I mean, clearly he had some 60s notion of peace and love man.
The main thing that Yoko and I are doing is to change the apathy that all the youth have, especially in America, which has infiltrated to Britain and to France and Germany, everywhere, because still everybody follows the American way of life, because that has the music and the whole style of this century is made by Americans. Now, at the moment, all the youth are apathetic and they think there's nothing to do and it's all over, and they all want to be on speed and junk and just kill themselves. Our job now is to tell them that there is still hope and we still have things to do, and we must get out there and change their heads and tell them it's okay, we can change it. It isn't over just because flower power didn't work. It's only the beginning. We're just in the inception of revolution. We're just at the beginning of change.
Everything was moving in a certain direction. You know, it had been moving that way since Bob Dylan sang The Times They Are Changing in 1964. And it was still gathering force and impetus when John lived in America to begin with. And I think it's understandable that the authorities were concerned about what he was up to.
The feeling was that rock and roll, popular music, was overturning all the apple carts, kicking over all the tables. And this made them all very nervous.
Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, brother, brother.
They know how to beat people up, they know how to gas them, and they have the arms and the equipment. And the mistake was made that the kids ended up playing their game of violence, you know, and they know how to be violent. They've been running it on violence for 2,000 years or a million or whatever it is. And nobody can tell me that violence is the way after all that time, you know. There must be another way, but a lot of people fell for it. And it's understandable in a way, because when the bully's actually right there, it's pretty hard to say, turn the other cheek, baby.
40 years ago, as we know, you know, a tremendous amount of demonstration, a tremendous amount of political engagement, but leavened with a tremendous sense of optimism, a kind of romantic ideal that we can change the world, that if we stand up, you know, and we are counted, it will make a difference.
Obviously, with Give Peace a Chance, he gave them an anthem. And he made people feel that it was okay to say, I'm for peace, I'm against war.
Give Peace a Chance, like one of the most simplest songs ever, but like such an important statement, and he knew that.
All we are saying is give peace a chance. All we are saying is give peace a chance.
We're going to stay in bed for 7 days, sort of, instead of having a private honeymoon. It's a private protest.
For the violence that's going in the world, you see.
To say,
we feel that instead of making war, it's better to just stay in bed. Let's stay in bed for spring.
and grow your hair.
Give peace a chance.
I mean, they're kind of childish dreams, aren't they? I mean, I mean, it's like that. If you had 3 wishes, what would you wish for? World peace, But it's, I mean, I think, politics are much more complicated, and have got more complicated and carry on getting more complicated.
For me, John Lennon's views on war and peace really are the equivalent of those of your average Miss World contestant who says, I want to bring world peace and feed everybody.
But, I mean, the world would be a beautiful place if everybody I loved each other, I mean, you can't argue with that, but it's just not the way it is.
I don't think his political views were ever particularly coherent.
We're artists and not politicians, not newspaper men and not anything. We're artists. We do it in the way that suits us best. And this is the way we work, and that's the trade I've learned, and I'm using it to the best of my ability.
You could argue that at least keeping the word peace and opposition to war on the front pages and on the news bulletins was better than nothing, but only marginally so, I think. He could have done far more effective things.
We all sit round pointing fingers at Nixon and the leaders of the country saying, he gave us peace or he gave us war. It's our responsibility what happens around the world, in every other country as well as your own. It's our responsibility for Vietnam and Biafra and Israel war and all the other wars that we don't quite hear about. It's all our responsibility, and when we all want peace, we'll get it.
He did have such a huge influence on the youth. Nixon obviously wasn't particularly enamoured with the idea of some little guy from Liverpool coming over and saying things and people taking them as gospel.
The last thing they want is some gobby scouser, turning up, demanding that they get out of Vietnam and leave everyone alone.
I would rather be a one-term president and do what I believe was right than to be a 2-term president and to see this nation accept the first defeat in its proud 190-year history.
The Nixon administration, not just in Watergate, but in other areas, was an incredibly paranoid administration. It used surveillance, it used tapes, it used monitoring as standard procedure. Now, to an extent, you have to be fair to them, because the Nixon administration came at a time when Vietnam was still going, when the people like the Black Panthers had caused some sort of chaos, and the Weathermen and other groups had attempted to destabilise American society in a way that no one had really attempted to destabilise it themselves. Now, because they were old and because they were out of touch and because they were paranoid and because they were fueled by an especially paranoid FBI, then this meant that they could attempt, quite successfully, to persecute and attempt to silence someone such as John Lennon.
How much interest do you take in the war that is going on in Vietnam now?
Well, we think about it every day, and we don't agree with it, and we think it's wrong. That's how much interest we take. That's all we can do about it, and say that we don't like it.
American young people, in their millions, turned on their elders, turned on the power brokers and the militarists in the United States. He was unashamed and unembarrassed about his support for the movement.
You could also see how the world view of somebody like J. Edgar Hoover would be so profoundly disturbed.
The FBI kept very extensive files on John Lennon, presumably with the acquiescence of the president, which it might look absurd, but you have to remember that Lennon and the few people who were in a similar position at that time did have enormous influence over not just the affections, but the sort of thought patterns of their audience.
It makes perfect sense that they would be hostile. How far they would go with that hostility, I have no way of knowing.
Vive la revolution.
More than 5,000 anti-war demonstrators, young and old, turned out for a rally. There were speeches, including one by New York Republican Senator Charles Goodell.
There are those who will say we are being unpatriotic. I say to you, the highest form of patriotism is to protest immorality in our government and immoral policy.
Cambodia, a small country of 7 million people, has been a neutral nation since the Geneva Agreement of 1954. American policy since then has been to scrupulously respect the neutrality of the Cambodian people.
Will you stop speaking out against the war?
No, nothing will stop me. I'll always say what I feel.
I think Hoover would have killed John Lennon if he could. Hoover was one of the most sinister men of the 20th century. He was a nasty, vicious, wicked person. And John Lennon was one of his public enemies. Certainly not number one, but he would have been in, to coin a phrase, the top 10.
We must get them excited about what we can do again. And that's why we're going to go on the road, but all the shows we'll do are free. Or all the money will go to prisoners or to poor people. So we'll collect no money for performance. For instance, we'd go to, say, Chicago, say, and then in the Chicago prison, say half or a quarter of the money earned that night would immediately go to release the first 500 people alphabetically that couldn't get bail to get out of prison. So wherever we go, the show will arrive and we'll release people in each town. So possibly when the Stones are touring America for money, we'll be touring for free. What are you going to do about that, Mick?
Flirted for a while with the Yippies and with the Black Panthers and with various movements, sort of semi-revolutionary movements of the late 60s and early 70s.
I find all of his politics very, very worrying. I mean, he was very prone to glorifying some extremely dubious people. For example, at one point, he helped finance a man called Michael X, who was a supposed British black power and black separatist activist. Well, actually what Michael X was an extortionist, in the end a murderer, and was hanged for murder. I mean, if you want to change the world, become a politician.
We specifically did the poster event around the world to try and get at least one plug-in for peace on earth at Christmas, because that's what it's about. When we have peace on earth, that poster won't exist only as history.
You have to admire John Lennon for what he was attempting to do, I think. But I think, you know, I mean, he's a bit of a dreamer, really. I mean, he even admits that in his songs, doesn't he? But I think, he was, in a way, I suppose he had a lot of power because of, creative power because of what he'd done and really didn't know what to do with it. He was frustrated because he didn't know about his parents and, the kind of bad childhood. So I think he was always looking for a way to, somehow focus this great power that he'd got as an artist in some way. So I think, that kind of activism was what he tried to do. But I don't know how, it was so idealistic. I mean, I never really took any of that seriously. But you have to admire him 100% for what he was trying to do.
John Lennon was brought to the emergency room at the Roosevelt site, St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, this evening, shortly before 11 p.m. He was dead on arrival.
John Lennon can't be dead.
He'll live forever. I pick up a tremendous sharing, outpouring of love from mostly the young people that come here, but all across the board. I think everyone seems to be saying to one another, why John Lennon?
were two things I was terrified of, actually. It was the world being destroyed and John Lennon dying. But then when he did die, I remember I was at school and someone told me, and I just thought, that was sort of like the bubble burst or something.
I remember vividly John Lennon being shot. My dad was crying, and it's the first time I've seen my dad cry.
Obviously, I remember it being very emotional, especially for the fans, people that were. I remember it being on TV, you know, with people outside the building with the flowers and stuff, and it being a tremendous upheaval for a lot of people because people loved him. People thought he was so important to them.
I was woken by the 7 o'clock news bulletin. It was a radio alarm, so you woke up to the news. And of course, that was the headline. And my then wife and I, silently, without exchanging a word, both simultaneously wept.
People kept playing, just like Starting Over, which was his single at the time, started playing it over and over again. And people started going down to Central Park, because you could see on the news, it was one of the first live news events.
As news of John Lennon's killing spread through New York, fans gathered at the gates to his apartment. The shooting happened just after Lennon and his wife Yoko stepped from a chauffeured car after returning from a recording session.
My first thought was the sheer, absolute waste of the life of a great man this killing represented, robbing the world of one of its greatest talents.
Although I didn't know him, I did feel this absolute sense of loss, the sense that an age of innocence was at its end.
Nobody loved me but my mother, and she could be jiving too.
It was almost like, well, of course, you know, what else can you expect from the world? We've been robbed of everybody that meant something to us, or everything that gave us a cause for optimism. Of course they're going to take John Lennon.
Well, it was unbelievable, of course, but it was also all too believable, because John was not somebody who hid away. One of the reasons he loved being in New York was that he could walk in the streets, he could walk in Central Park, he could walk in Greenwich Village. You know, and New York being New York, he didn't really get hassled. And he liked the kind of village aspect of it. He could become part of the life of this very extraordinary and stimulating village. But with that, there would always have been the danger of some crazy stepping out of the shadows and doing something unspeakable.
4 years ago, Chapman came to Hawaii looking for the good life. 6 weeks ago, at this gun shop, Chapman bought a .38 caliber short-barrel revolver. On the gun permit, he indicated he was then unemployed. Chapman had no known local current police record, thus the gun sale was legal. But on October 23rd, the day he quit his security guard job at this building, he signed out on the log with the name John Lennon. Then he crossed out the entry.
Of course, there have been conspiracy theories surrounding John Lennon's death, as though, you know, were with both the Kennedy brothers and so on, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. But I think Mark Chapman was just alone crazy.
You know, I was ready for conspiracy theories, but I don't think I latched on to them at the time.
It's very difficult to understand the murder of John Lennon. All is not what it seems. I'm pretty sure about that. But what it actually is would be, I think, irresponsible for me to speculate.
I think I actually thought there was this big, evil, powerful force which was, you know, which murdered John Lennon, you know, but it's like, it's not really like that, is it? It's like, I mean, they didn't understand as much as he didn't. You know, both sides didn't understand each other or know what they wanted or know what they were afraid of.
I think if there had been a mystery after his death, if we hadn't caught Chapman and, you know, immediately had a plausible scenario, as disturbing and as random and as horrible as it was, I think that one might have started to think deep, dark thoughts about J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and all that kind of thing.
Undoubtedly, those that hated him would have wished him dead. I've got no doubt about that. It's a sin to wish people dead, but J. Edgar Hoover was a real sinner. And I suspect that in the timbers of the secret state in the United States, there may be some answers to what happened that dreadful day.
You know, I certainly don't think that it would be beyond J. Edgar Hoover or the FBI to try and engineer John Lennon's death.
Is it likely that this individual, for the reasons stated, murdered John Lennon for no reason other than 15 minutes of fame? I doubt that very much. He has not at any time sought to accentuate that fame. In fact, seems to be almost a vegetable, human vegetable.
When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we'll see.
I never met John, but I grew up with his son Sean as one of my best friends. So I spent so much time, you know, in that apartment and with the white piano where, you know, he wrote Imagine, and spending holidays and stuff with Sean and Yoko. You know, I felt like his aura, legacy, whatever you want to say, was so much around all the time that I don't feel close to him like I knew him, but he was always just such a presence, you know.
I think if you were around when John was around, you have to miss his presence because he was such fun to have in the world. You know, he went quiet for a long time, as some artists do. They need a period out of the spotlight, just reconstructing their lives after the sort of maelstrom of celebrity.
What's interesting about someone like John Lennon is we don't have people like that in popular culture anymore. So we don't have you know, musicians or artists or actors that really do stand up with that kind of power and talk about it very, very directly and very honestly and say what they think, not worrying about what effect that will have on them as an individual.
I don't think making political statements is very popular among heroes of popular culture today, because popular culture, popular entertainment has become so corporatized that musicians, film people, actors are very wary of upsetting people, I think, by making statements.
But basically what happens in the music business now, which is really sad, is that the people who have the most control are the furthest away from creativity.
So although there was that great explosion of protest in the 60s that lasted through the 70s, people have become very passive since then, I think. They don't feel that activism suits them. They don't feel it's going to get them anywhere. It's rather depressing.
Especially with Iraq and the Middle East, I feel like no one really stands up, and nobody like him in that position and that is that popular has the balls to stand up and go, this is wrong, and this is wrong for this reason, this reason, and this reason, and we kind of need that, and we don't have it.
And for peace or anything, it's all down to this relationship. To work on this relationship with Yoko is very hard, and we've got the gift of love, you know, but love is like a precious plant. You've got to really look after it, and love you have to water and be careful of it and keep the flies off and see that it's all right and nurture it, you know.
The legacy is that he will be loved and admired as long as human beings have souls. And I pray that that will be always.
I love like all the balls and grit that he put into everything that he did, and he's That's why he will be remembered as one of the greatest of all time.
It's something that gets stronger and doesn't fade, because the more you listen to him, the more you realise how great he was as a musician and an artist, and how important as a cultural and political figure he was too.
I'm very, very sad to think what might have been, and how, you know, how much pleasure we might have got from his continued presence, because, you know, he carried on being an enthusiast for all sorts of things.
I certainly think he would have supported our convoys to Gaza. The mind boggles at the idea of him atop a truck, breaking the siege and standing by the Mediterranean and addressing a refugee camp, singing Imagine, singing Power to the People, singing Give Peace a Chance. My goodness, what a wonderful thought.
This 60s bit was just a sniff. The 60s was just waking up in the morning, you know, and we haven't even got to dinner time yet. And I can't wait, you know, I just can't wait. I'm so glad to be around.
A working class hero is something to be. A working class hero is something to be. They hurt you at home and they hit you at school. They hate you if you're clever and they despise a fool.